Hey YouTube, it's David from Live Forever or Die Trying, coming to you with an October wrap-up on this warm November day. Before we jump into it, I want to thank all of y'all for 1,500 subscribers. It kind of blows me away. I don't expect to hit these milestones, really. I also have to give a big thanks to Steve Donahue for having me on to do an interview with him, where he talked about a lot of my background, why I got into reading, and kind of my history with this channel, as well as wrapped up the interview by talking about longevity and life extension and, what I would want in an ideal world. So that was pretty fun to do. Got a lot of new faces here, so I appreciate him for that. If you haven't seen it and you want to, I will leave a link for that below, either in a pinned comment or in the description box. But yeah, so back to the video. Let's get into the October wrap-up. I've got 6 books for you today. It was a very audiobook heavy month. And we had a little bit on politics, a little bit on climate change, and a little bit on bodily sciences, so we have a good mix. To start out with, we had The Conscience of a Conservative by Jeff Flake. So I read this more right-wing book in a kind of response to a lot of the leftist thought that I've been reading recently, and I'm glad I picked this one up. So it was a big problem for me to find a right-wing book that was, I guess, non-blind faith in Trump. I looked quite a few times at different local bookstores and like the Overdrive app and what have you, and a lot of them just felt wrong. You read that first chapter and you're like, this is going to be a waste of time. But I'm glad I ended up on this one. So Jeff Flake is I guess, traditional conservative or possibly libertarian. I think he's registered with the GOP, and he's either a senator or congressman out of Arizona. So this book was named after Barry Goldwater's book in the 60s, I believe, which is The Conscience of a Conservative. And basically it's a call to action to get back to conservative values within the GOP party. And the reason he writes this is in response to the Trump presidency. He basically sets up the book with saying, hey, Republicans, our voter base is white and they are old. If we do not change our policies or our values to be more inclusive of other people, our party is just gonna age out and die. So he talks about the road that the current GOP is going down, specifically with Trump and a lot of this us versus them kind of rhetoric. He especially is sore when Trump called Mexicans racist. Personally, he grew up on a farm and he worked side by side with immigrants, so that informs a lot of his opinions. Now, the key things he touches on this book are smaller government, less taxes, and then just basically better PR relations with the White House. So to touch on the smaller government, I actually liked what he had to say with a lot of it. Basically, he said, you got police violence on blacks. How do you fix that? Less government. He didn't straight up say defund the police, but you can see where he was going with that. He said, you have these problems with ICE and this unhumane treatment of immigrants. He's like, how do you fix that? Less government involvement in that. And basically goes down about 10 different kind of lines to talk about why this involvement of government is bad. So I did like kind of seeing that slant. Personally, it came off as very libertarian for me, but I enjoyed reading about it. And then he has about another third of the book that just talks about lowering taxes. He has a sense of humor about it. He talks about how when he first got into Congress, he sounded like the Rain Man, just going, marginal tax cuts, marginal tax cuts, marginal tax cuts. And just the way he read about it and talked about it in his book was kind of funny. I don't agree with a lot of the policies there, or at least I'm not informed enough about economics to make a decision on it, but I did think it was pretty humorous. Up next, we tried to get away from politics a little bit, and we read The Human, the Orchid, and the Octopus by Jacques Cousteau. And as a certified scuba diver, I felt it was a sin if I did not read the books of the original pioneer of the field. If you're not familiar, Jacques Cousteau was like an environmentalist. He traveled all around the world, interacting with different populations. Basically, he was the Discovery Channel. And this was a really cool book. The first third of it really just talks straight up about his adventures, getting trapped in the Antarctic in a blizzard on his boat and losing 4 of the 5 propellers. It talks about him getting a carbon monoxide leak, 500 feet underground in a cave. It talks about the raptures of the deep and just all this really, really interesting stuff about traveling and scuba diving and nature, which was fantastic. If that was the only part of the book, I'd rate it 5 out of 5 immediately, just done. However, then we get into conservation, and that's not a bad thing. But within conservation, we had about a third of the book that was a diatribe on nuclear weapons and kind of intercontinental struggle around nuclear power. And it just kind of felt dated. I do think this book is from the 80s and it was reprinted. And I just felt it took away from the opening third of the book. If I had to rate this chapter independently, it would be a 2 out of 5. And then finally, I liked the ending of it, but on Goodreads, I saw a lot of people did not. The last third of the book, he kind of goes into like this psychedelic diatribe about if we fix everything and we get back to Earth and like we become loving, altruistic people, this is the future we have to look forward to. And he talks about humans living to 15,000 years old, being genetically modified with gills so they can swim with dolphins who are genetically engineered to be super intelligent and can talk to us. Which I just love, kind of like the esotericness and the fucking weirdness to it all. But it was definitely out there. I was surprised that a book from the 1980s about environmentalism talked about longevity and life extension. Like, that was a big part of the ending of the book, where he's basically said, if we can pull our shit together, we can solve aging, you guys. And then once we solve aging, we can talk to the dolphins. Like, we're there. I thought it was absolutely hilarious. But yeah, for the average reader, it's probably a 3 out of 5, which I think I rated this book a 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 total. But it was fun. If you want to get into this whole thing, it's great. I would recommend the first third to absolutely anybody. I would recommend the second third to nobody, and then the third to a limited few. But I enjoyed it greatly. Up next, we had Breath by James Nestor. This is a very bro-science-y book. I saw it being passed around on like Joe Rogan as well as Ben Greenfield and a lot of these other biohackers. And I'm like, okay, he just wrote a 300-page book on how to breathe. Yeah, this is going to be like, he's just out here trying to make money. He's like writing some clickbait stuff. But I was surprised once I actually got into it. It's kind of like a combination of like a Michael Pollan style book where he combines like personal self-experimentation and memoir with diving into the history of certain breathing techniques, whether it's from yogis or Wim Hof or free diving or what have you. And it basically just talks about all the ways you can manipulate the human body with breathing. Specifically, he talked about how absolutely trash mouth breathing is, and he did an experiment where he plugged his nostrils for, I believe, 2 weeks, and then basically recorded all the negative side effects that his body had with basically borderline pneumonia, and then mucus, and then like ulcers, well, not ulcers, but messed up nose stuff. And it was really he kind of went the extra mile on that aspect of the book. And then the actual general history of breathing techniques was very interesting as well. He talked about everything from how athletes can manipulate their breath for better performance, basically how breathing harder doesn't really work because oxygen uptake is not beneficial for oxygen uptake. However, increasing CO2 load can be beneficial in some circumstances. And then he goes into like free diving, where people can hold their breath for up to 10 minutes and then dive down into the ocean to multiple hundred feet. And just the stories and the history around a lot of that was super interesting. I ended up really liking this book, which was kind of a surprise for me. So I think I would rate it 4 out of 5 or so. Then we come back to 2 books on politics and then finish up with another Michael Pollan book. So for the first of the last 2 on politics, we have the Care Manifesto, and this is by the Care Collective. So this is put out as a little mini-series from Verso Books. They have like some on coronavirus and climate change and economics, and I liked it, but it felt very, I want to say maybe idealistic. Basically, this book talks about caring and interdependence and it talks about how undervalued labor when spent on care is, whether that is emotional support or childcare or community development and what have you, and basically how if you put care at the center of your politics, it can fix multiple aspects of society. However, at the same time, it's also telling you to pull away rapidly from like capitalism and how these certain ideas are damaging the system of care. And it just comes across to me as half complete because it almost prescribes you to pull completely out of this system, and then it tells you if you just cared a little bit more, you'd be able to get through this. And I don't know, it just didn't feel full-throated enough of a solution. I do like what they were talking about, how motherly labor is undervalued, and it should be something that should be paid for possibly. Andrew Yang talked about this with his UBI and his tax incentive program. But I agreed with a lot of what they actually had to say on the care itself. But this being a fairly short book, coming in at just over 100 pages, I felt like it wasn't a full prescription to the problem. I think it was a good introductory text on this, however. The second to last book was also about politics. It was On Fire, which is by Naomi Klein. So I think this might be the third Naomi Klein book I've read so far. And basically it's a collection of essays that kind of succinctly talks about what causes have brought us to climate change. So she talks about like disaster capitalism. She talks about basically corporatism and settler colonialism and whatnot. And basically a lot of these various things that made us believe we had endless resources and us running out of them and now seeing climate change for the first time. So On Fire, obviously, she talks about a world burning in this book. And specifically, she talks about who's being affected by this. So like indigenous populations, third world countries, as well as countries that are just slower on the uptake. So, obviously you have like Europe and the US, which have burned a lot of the carbon in recent history, and we've gotten to a developed state. But then you have people coming onto the scene like China and India who, have 1 billion people, and they want to catch up to us. Is it fair for us to tell them they can't do that? But at the same time, India, for example, is a low-lying country as far as like sea level goes. So if climate change, melts the glaciers, like they're going to get literally swamped. And it kind of talks about all this interplay on a global scale with climate change. So if this is something you're interested in, it's a good book to pick up. Like I said, it's a series of essays, and it kind of ties multiple ethical aspects of the conversation together, and then talks a little bit about economics as well. So this is a book for like a case for the Green New Deal, and one of the things I especially liked about it was Naomi basically said, hey, we don't want to put oil and gas workers out on the streets. Like, we don't want to do that. So part of this Green New Deal plan, what needs to happen to make it work is, government paying for training to get these people into renewables and whatnot. And I really did like her talking about that economic approach to this specific problem. Overall, I'd probably rate this book 3.5, 4 out of 5. I wish it was a little more cohesive maybe, but it is a series of essays, so it's almost like blog post style. So I guess, going into it knowing that, probably 4 out of 5 read. And then finally we have The Omnivores Dilemma by Michael Pollan. This is probably his most well-known book. Specifically, I got into Michael Pollan through reading How to Change Your Mind, which is about like psychedelic use and whatnot. And then I read, forgetting the title, but another one of his books, which was about basically how we co-evolved with the different species of plants like marijuana and potatoes and tulips and whatnot, and how plants have kind of, groomed us to spread their genomes. And I really like the way Michael Pollan writes, which is like a memoir-esque science journalism style. And this book brings that as well. Being his most popular book, you'll probably enjoy it. This being his most popular book, I had high hopes going into it, and I liked it when I read it. However, after talking to some people, I changed my opinion a little bit. And let me get into that. So basically what this book talks about, the Omnivores Dilemma, is basically trying to figure out like what we're eating, what actually goes into it, and what is like the consequences of that. So he starts off by talking about how the majority of what we eat in like America is corn-based products. And he talks about how corn is harvested and then like transmuted into like these 10 different products and then put in absolutely everything. And then basically does a little journalistic piece about each different type of food chain. So basically he buys a cow and puts it in the industrial food chain and then tracks it as it goes through the process and says, basically this is what you're eating if you buy this from a grocery store. Then he comes to organic farming and say, hey, these are the pros of organic farming, these are the cons. And then reels that all the way down until he gets to Joel Salatin with Polyface Farms and a regenerative agriculture system that helps the earth, has the healthiest food with the least antibiotics, and you're supporting local communities. So that's the point where I really kind of like turned on to this book and I was like, hey, I like this a lot. I'm going to start reading about more permaculture, reading about regenerative farming, and I've been on a rabbit hole with that recently. But this actually led me to go to a farmer's market recently. And I was talking to some farmers at the farmer's market. Specifically, I brought up Joel Salatin. And this book was published back in 2006, something like that. But when I brought up Joel Salatin, they actually kind of like retreated from the conversation a little bit. So I was a little kind of like, okay, what was that about? Turns out that Joel has been under a lot of flack recently because basically he's making a business selling these regenerative practices that he kind of just robbed from other cultures. And on top of that, he's been like, I don't want to say anything that isn't necessarily true. So let me say that what I read was an opinion piece that basically said that this type of farming isn't sustainable economically. So he's selling this idea to people through this book and his other interviews that could put people into poverty because of numbers that may or may not be true. And if that's the case, it'd be really problematic. So yeah, I do still have a big interest in permaculture and like regenerative farming, but maybe Joel Salatin isn't the person to go to about that. I do need to read more about that particular subject specifically. But overall, back to the book, Omnivores Dilemma. Basically, I think it's an amazing book. In the closing part of it, he talks about how he's been written letters about this book. Basically, some vegans have decided they're going to eat meat as long as it's locally grown and ethically harvested. But at the same time, some people were so disgusted with the industrial food chain that they became vegan and vegetarian. And I just think it's a interesting book to read no matter where you come at the book from like a personal diet perspective. But yeah, overall I'll probably rate it 4 out of 5. And yeah, that wraps up October. As always, let me know if you've read any of these. I would love to have you add me on Goodreads to see what you guys are reading and to make me some more recommendations. If you like the video, go ahead and subscribe and drop that below. Definitely help me along the algorithm and get me the dopamine I desperately, desperately need. All right, guys, until next time. See ya.